Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a truly infamous work from the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther's 1543 treatise on the Jews and their lies. We're going to break down how he builds his argument, the claims he makes, and why this text is still so profoundly challenging to this day.
Okay, so let's get right into it. Luther frames this entire, pretty dense work around this one single, incredibly provocative question. And he's not just being rhetorical. For him, the answer to this question explains absolutely everything. He actually writes that any Christian who wants to debate a Jewish person should start right here.
He kicks things off by presenting a premise that in his mind is just undeniable. Luther argues that the long history of suffering and exile of the Jewish people isn't some historical accident. He sees it as active, divine proof of God's anger.
And notice how he uses this very specific number. For Luther, this isn't just some vague historical fact. It's the bedrock of his whole theological case. He's saying, look, this isn't just random bad luck. This is a punishment so severe and so long-lasting, it has to have a divine explanation.
For Luther, the logic here is pretty simple. If they were still God's chosen people, there's no way God would let them suffer this horribly for this long. He calls their suffering a work of fury, which for him is all the evidence he needs to say they are no longer God's people and he is no longer their God. And that conclusion, well, it becomes the foundation for everything else he's about to say.
So once he's established that premise, Luther starts to build his case by trying to systematically tear down what he sees as the three main pillars of Jewish religious identity. He kind of dismissively calls them their boasts.
His goal here is to argue that all of their claims to having a special status, based on being descended from the patriarchs, their covenant of circumcision, and getting the law from Moses, are, in his view, completely invalid. So let's take a look at each one.
First up, the boast of lineage, or their bloodline. Luther argues that being proud of your physical ancestry is just, an earthly arrogance. He says that before God, we're all just dust and ashes. And the only birth that actually matters is a spiritual one through faith, not a physical one through your family tree.
And to back this up, he pulls quotes straight from the New Testament. He uses words from John the Baptist and Jesus to argue that physical descent, if it's not paired with what he considers true faith, is worthless. And then he takes it a huge step further, claiming it doesn't signify a divine heritage, but a demonic one.
All right, let's move to the second boast. Luther's argument here is that circumcision can't possibly be the one defining mark of God's people because, hey, other nations that came from Abraham, like the Ishmaelites, also practiced it. For him, the physical act itself means nothing without an inner spiritual change.
Now, what's really interesting is he pulls this quote directly from the Hebrew Scriptures, from Deuteronomy, to make his point. He's basically trying to argue that the prophets themselves were demanding a spiritual circumcision, a circumcision of the heart. He claims that focusing only on the physical part, while having, as he puts it, an uncircumcised heart, is the very reason for God's anger.
And finally, he goes after the pride in receiving the law at Sinai. Luther's counterargument here is pretty sharp. Just having God's law doesn't make you holy. In fact, he claims, if you know the law and you don't keep it, you are even more guilty than someone who never got it in the first place.
I mean, this is a really extreme comparison, but you can see the core of his logic. To Luther, knowing the law isn't the key. It's all about obedience and faith. He argues that since the Jewish people, in his view, haven't obeyed, having the law only makes their condemnation deeper.
Okay, so after dismissing what he sees as their claims to being a chosen people, Luther then turns to their hope for the future, the coming of the Messiah. And his goal is to prove, using their own scriptures, that this hope is a huge mistake. So he pulls together these key prophecies from the Hebrew Bible to build what he presents as this inescapable timeline. He's arguing that these prophecies create a really specific window in history for the Messiah to arrive, and it's a window that, he's about to claim, slammed shut a long time ago.
And right here, you can see how his interpretation plays out. He argues the scepter of rule left Judah with King Herod, the Second Temple, destroyed in 70 AD. That timeline from the prophet Daniel, he calculates that it also ran out.
So for Luther, all three of these points lead to one single irrefutable conclusion. The Messiah must have already come.
And this is where the text pivots from a theological argument to some truly infamous recommendations. After laying out his entire case, Luther finishes with what he chillingly calls his sincere advice for Christian rulers.
He presents this final section not as some hateful rant, but as the logical, necessary consequence of everything he's just argued. In his mind, if all of this is true, then certain actions have to be taken to protect Christians and honor God.
And this list, it's the horrific endpoint of his logic. He lays out this 7-point plan for the complete and total suppression of Jewish life, religious, economic, and social. Everything from burning synagogues to forcing people into hard labor. And he presents all of it as a necessary act of piety.
This final quote just captures the absolute, unshakable certainty that's driving this entire work. It's a statement of complete contempt for any worldview that isn't his own. It reveals a conviction so total that he finds the alternative not just wrong, but sub-him.
And so that's the question we're left with. Luther's text is a powerful and frankly disturbing example of where that kind of absolute theological certainty can lead. It forces us to think about how ideas, especially when someone is so utterly convinced they are right, can turn into devastating actions that just echo for centuries.